panika med pappren. Jag ska bara försöka sortera ut dem och komma lite mer. Det kommer liksom blanda de här presentationerna.
Welcome everyone. Thank you for being here with us tonight. I will introduce our honorable speaker in a minute, and we will proceed with a quick lecture and then a session of questions and answers. Before starting our lecture, I just want to make a quick announcement about the security measures. In case of alarm, we will proceed to the shelters. So please, we can take a seat and I will introduce you more formally. Clicker is here. My name is Timothy Brick. I am the rector at the Kyiv School of Economics. And tonight we are honored to host a very special guest. Before introducing you, I also want to say express our sincere gratitude to the government of Sweden and for all the support which Sweden has provided to Ukraine during the war and before the war, and also to support and partnership with our university specifically. Last year we also hosted Ulf Kristersson, which was a huge honor, and today we host you. Erik Thedéen, governor of the Riksbank and the chairman of this institution, chairman of the executive board, economist who served as the Director General of Swedish Financial Supervisory Authority. Also, as far as I understand, you have experience with Navy and military training, and you received your master's at the Stockholm School of Economics, which is our partner. It's our partner in institution, and we have a lot of friends and colleagues there. We are very honored to have you. Our institution has trained many Ukrainian economists and people who work in the National Bank of Ukraine and other financial institutions. And I think for us, the lecture that you're going to present is of a special interest. After you conclude your lecture, I will moderate questions and answers. So thank you. The clicker is yours, so the floor is yours, and thank you for the lecture.
Thank you very much. And thank you for having me. And I was visiting the National Bank of Ukraine before this meeting, and I met with the governor, and he had a message to me, to you, saying that I should have an inspirational speech, because then maybe you will be interested in becoming central bankers. And he wanted to recruit a lot of talented people from this school. So I'm not sure that I will succeed in that, but you could feel the message from the governor of the National Bank of Ukraine that for sure they need talented people. It's an honor to be here. It's really nice to be here. It brings me back to when I was a young student in the Stockholm School of Economics. Great memories from that time. I actually started my career at the Central Bank of Sweden for actually 2.5 years. 2.5 years that was extremely important for me. And I will come back to that when it comes to also policy, but also I met my wife there. So that was important also for that reason. I will say a few words about various parts of what we do, and maybe the first picture, yes, to bring this into context. So Sweden, Euro area, United States might be not the most humble picture you've seen, because of course Sweden is substantially smaller than both Euro area and the US. But just to get the numbers, population-wise, of course much smaller than Ukraine. Inflation is coming down. So we have had inflation double-digit, which was a surprise for us when it came, and actually triggered us to hike interest rates from 0 to 4%. But knock on wood, it's coming down. So we got a good print the other day. So now there's a lot of expectations in Sweden that we should cut rate next year. We have so far said that we will not. And in that sense, we are similar to many other central banks in the world, including the ECB, that are basically seeing better inflation outlook, but maybe a little bit reluctant to actually say that they will cut. We will be data dependent. I think the employment rate is important. Sweden is one of the countries with the highest employment rates, so in the world. Both female and male participation is extremely high. That actually leads to a fairly high unemployment as well, because we have a lot of people in the workforce. But still, I think the labor market is a labor market very much both for women and for men. I actually had, I need to brag now when I sit in front of you here. On Saturday, I had lunch with a Nobel Prize winner in economics. As you know, this prize is delivered in Stockholm, and that is actually a prize that was originally founded and sponsored by the Riksbank. So by tradition, we have lunch with the winner on the day before the award. And she has been, as you probably know, spent a lot of time in her research thinking about gender balance and what drives gender balance through mostly the American history, but also in different other countries. And in that concept, it was interesting to speak to her, given the Swedish experience with a fairly, I would say, high very high women participation in the labor force. Again, policy rate at 4%. We hiked in September. We paused in November. And now we will have a next meeting in January, and I will not tell you what we're going to do then, but that's a lot of speculation going on in that space. I think that's enough to set the scene. As you can see, again, it's a similar development in many of the other countries. I will say a few words about the inflation targeting framework. I will bring you back to 1992. 1992, we were in a cost crisis. We had a fixed exchange rate. The idea was to have fixed exchange rate and then force the economy to adapt to the outside world, i.e. same inflation as the rest of the world, same wages in the rest of the world. So that will be the way to have a more stable economy. That was the fixed exchange regime. Problem was that the wage formation and the prices didn't adapt, so we got a cost crisis. So that created a strong pressure on the krona. We intervened a lot. I say we because I was actually at the central bank at the time. Intervened a lot from the foreign exchange reserve. We had to let go of the krona in November 1992, but it ended with 500% in interest rates. 500%. That was a way to try to get foreign capital into the Swedish krona market rather than leaving the market. Again, that failed, and that ended up in a big discussion in Sweden what to do next. We have tried with fixed exchange rates for a number of years. It has failed in devaluation and now in a floating exchange rate, and we're talking now November 1992. Eventually, there was a discussion, so what's the state of the art? That became inflation targeting. It started in New Zealand, eventually Canada, then UK. And the idea was that if we have an inflation target, that would be the steer, that would be the thing that sends credibility, that would be the anchor for the stability of the economy. That would be the anchor for the price setting, that would be the anchor for the wage formation. So in a sense, it was the same idea as the fixed exchange rate, but with another way of doing it. And I've put down like four words which I think is extremely important when you're talking about inflation targeting. That's quantified target, that's independence of the central bank, that's accountability, and that's transparency. Let me say a few words on, starting from the bottom there. If you give a central bank a lot of power, if you give a central bank technocrats, me, a lot of power, then you need to have transparency and accountability. The central bank need to explain to the outside world why they're setting rate in a certain way and on what conditions and what is the kind of steer. And that's the transparency part. That resulted, and of course that had been developed through the years, in a monetary policy report, which we publish every day, every time we have a monetary policy meeting. That's the forecast on inflation, that's the forecast on unemployment, that's the forecast of GDP, that's an outlook on what's going on in the outside world, that's an outlook what's going on in financial markets, that's even an interest rate path where we actually say that this is the most likely outcome of our interest rate path. That's extreme transparency. Also, we publish, I think we are one of the few, maybe the only, I think it may be one or two more, that publish our minutes from the meetings with the specific member of the board mentioned. So you could read, and you could see that in our webpage. You go into the webpage, you could see Erik Thedéen, me, said this and that on this meeting and argued for a hike or for a pause or for a cut or whatever it is. And the same for all my colleagues, 4 of them. And that's the transparency argument. So you could then be accountable. So the ones, and there's a lot of people that want to evaluate us, both formally and informally, journalists, economists, but of course also the parliament. When they do that, of course, they go into the minutes and they evaluate, was the reasoning reasonable by the governor, by the deputy governors, and that's the accountability. So we have this power, we have the independence, but we're also transparent and accountable. Independence, then I would like to take in kind of two parts. Independence is both legally and practically. So legally, it's a constitutional issue. That's a thing that we need to do being part of the European monetary system. We're not part of the euro, but we're part of the kind of overall central bank system. Then we need to have the constitutional independence. That means basically that the government can't call me up and say, I think you should cut interest rates. If they do that, and if they do that persistently, they are going against the constitution, or against the independence of the central bank. That's not, so typically politicians don't do that. So that's the legal independence. It's also legal independence. It's very, very hard to fire me and my colleagues, more or less impossible. If I get really drunk and hit people and so on, then they might be able to fire me. But seriously, it's extremely difficult. It's like, it's very hard to fire a high judge in the legal system. It's also very hard to fire me. So I'm not afraid of keeping my job when I'm arguing with the ministry or with the general public what rate we think we should have to fight inflation. But it's also practical. So independence could not be done in a vacuum. You need to have the trust and the credibility with the political system and with the general public. If you lose that, you might have the constitutional independence, but you will struggle if you don't have the, let's say, practical or de facto independence and credibility and trustworthiness with the political system and the general public. So this is a balancing act which we're trying to pursue all the time. And the way of doing that is transparency and accountability, of course. And then quantified target, yeah, we should be specific what we're aiming at, and we have a 2% inflation target. We say that we pursue a flexible inflation targeting policy. Why do we say that? We're not going for 2% every single day, every single month. We're going around 2%. So that should be the kind of lighthouse that we're looking for, 2%. But if it's in one period 2.5 and the next period 1.5, that should be in line with that flexible targeting. But if it's 10%, as it was a little bit more than a half year ago, then for sure it's not within the boundaries of flexible, then it's far too high, and then we need to act. If we don't, we will lose credibility, we will lose the anchor, and then wage formation and price setting might not be in line with our goal. So that's the inflation targeting. We also have a role within financial stability. Financial stability it's different in different countries. I used to be, as was introduced here, the head of the Swedish Supervisory Authority. And in Sweden, basically, that authority both have regulation and supervision of markets, insurance, banks, as well as macroprudential. So they have, you could say, the main share of financial stability. But you can never exclude a central bank from financial stability. In a crisis situation, central banks have a key role in providing liquidity. And that has been done many times by the Riksbank, but for sure also by others. Latest now actually by the Federal Reserve in the crisis of Silicon Valley Bank, where they introduced this repo facility to provide liquidity to the banking system. So liquidity is always key. Also the infrastructure, mainly infrastructure for payments, is a key concern of ours, because for sure we are responsible for the payment system. We might think of cash, but it's not only cash, it's all, of course, the whole overall payment system. So the financial stability, you could say we have an oversight role. We cooperate with the Financial Stability Authority, And in a crisis situation, the balance of power shifts from the supervisor to the central bank, because the crisis operations are much more in the hands of central bank than supervisors. So let me say a few words on what challenges we have when it comes to financial stability, and some specificities for Sweden, but more generally, banks are typically extremely leveraged. There is this metric called leverage ratio. So leverage ratio is basically the capital divided by the total asset of the bank, and that's in Sweden around 4.5%. So compare that with a normal company on the stock exchange, you will see that they are much more leveraged than many other corporates. Having said that, that has actually been increased still, the capital. So since the financial crisis back in 2008, the capitalization of banks have increased. And also on a risk-weighted basis, the capitalization has increased a lot. And also, of course, we have a lot of indebtedness in the private sector, especially household sector. So if I talk to my friends, they all have a lot of mortgages and they all have variable rates. So basically, when we hike rates, it hits directly the Swedish households, especially in larger cities, Stockholm, Gothenburg, and Malmö, where they buy expensive houses and they're highly indebted. Compare that to Germany and France. They have less indebtedness, and they have all of them have fixed mortgages. So when ECB hike rates, the French household doesn't see that much of it, because they basically have a 20 or 30-year fixation of their interest rates. Same for Germany. So this is a feature of the Swedish economy that is to some extent good, because monetary policy bites, but it's also a little bit of a problematic. It might be too tough, you could say, the financial or the monetary policy. So I think I'll pursue here. Payment system. So when we had the meetings today with the central bank, we talked a lot about the payment system. I know that Ukraine is going in our direction, namely to digitalize the payment system. So hands up, who has used cash the last week? That's still much more actually than I would see in a Swedish class. Last month. The same people, right? We use cash all the time. So when we ask Swedes about this, how many used cash for the last transaction, Swedes in general, not students, it's like 8%. It used to be like 40% 10 years ago. So it's a rapid decrease. So if I go out shopping, I don't like to shop actually, but if I were to go out shopping in Stockholm, I could not only rely on cash. I need to have my card with me, because many shops are cash free. So yes, please come and shop here, but we don't take cash. That's becoming a habit in many Swedish cities. So it's a rapid digitalization, and many aspects of that is good. It's very efficient. We also have this mobile pay, so I could pay my colleagues here. If we go to restaurants and we want to split the invoice, we just swish, as it's called, each other money through the mobile phone. Extremely efficient. But from a stability point of view, there is issues. The strong network effects, so you get private monopolies. They become critical for the payment system. I'll give you one example. If you do mobile pay, you need to identify yourself, and you do that through an app called Bank ID. Bank ID is developed by the banking system. It's, knock on wood, secure and fine, but it's becoming so critical, not only in the banking system, but for everything in the daily life for Swedes. Logging into your homepage of your local kind of running club or sailing club or whatever, going into social insurance, register your car, and doing all your bank business. So this is extremely critical, fine, but what happens if Bank ID doesn't work any longer? So this is the issue when you go to digitalization. You let go of the cash, but of course you get extremely vulnerable for any cyber attacks, or other problems in the payment system. So what we are trying to do now is a little bit to go back a little bit and ensure that the digital system is also redundant. So if one app breaks down, we have another app. And if we're talking about bank identification, for example. Because this will be extremely dependent, of course, on electricity and data. We can't kind of go back in history. We will not have a cash society again, but I would like to have a little bit of cash in the system. I've also listened to your fellow Ukrainians in the central bank, and what they said when this dreadful war broke out, the first initial way of acting from the households was actually to withdraw a lot of cash and to pay in the stores with cash. Eventually, you, as Ukrainians, turn into more digital payments. But I think that tells a story. In the event of a crisis, you need to have alternatives to digital payments. And of course, cash is something that's more physical and in that sense could be used. We will see if we are able to back into a little bit more of cash, because the train is moving very, very fast into a cashless society. We're also looking into CBDC. I don't know whether you've been talking about in your classes, but basically, if you think about the payment system, the basis for that is central bank money, and then come back to cash. So you have money in your bank account, but you know that in the crisis situation, again, what happened here when the war broke out, you could withdraw and turn it into cash. And what is cash? Cash is central bank money. That's a claim on the balance sheet of the central bank. If you don't use cash any longer, so what do you then use? What is then the anchor of the payment system? Here, CBDC comes in. That's one of the arguments that maybe there should be some anchor that, anyway, in the minds of people reminds them that, well, we could trust the payment system because it's eventually a link here into the central bank. So this has been heavily discussed in the central bank community. We were on the forefront on that. We have not launched a CBDC. The Euroland, ECB, is fairly advanced in this. So we are now thinking of more kind of developing in close relation with Euroland. But there's more or less every country now is one way or the other looking into CBDC. Only a few have launched it. So we'll see. Where that end up. Should I say a few words about the task that we also have in the new Riksbank Act? We have a new law for the Riksbank. It's not a major difference to the old Act. But one thing that we got in the new Act was that we should preserve payments in the event of a crisis or wartime. So now we are trying to do what you are so much better on, unfortunately, in Ukraine, namely to safeguard payments also in wartime. So that's been one of the things we discussed with people here in Ukraine, is what could we learn from Ukraine's central bank, but also for the banking system, to make payments possible also in a war situation. And here I said a little bit about this bank aid idea. There's a lot of things we need to think through here, to not only to have cash as an alternative. How do we have safe electricity? How do we safeguard that we have alternative internet, and so on and so forth? And we have been in peace in Sweden for more than 200 years. So we are becoming naive. We are becoming naive that we will always live in peace. And my grandfather, who's died for many years ago, my father, fortunately, also died a couple of years ago. My grandfather was a teacher in history. He also always told me, and especially my father, that never, ever forget the threat from Russia. But if I asked my kids about this before this dreadful war, they wouldn't understand it, because they haven't seen any threat from Russia. I understand it, because I was brought up during the Cold War, so I saw it. But the younger generation thought that it would always be peace and everything was fine. That has radically changed, and of course you are sadly aware of it, but it's also changing for Sweden. We have a history of fighting wars with Russia before the 200 years of peace, that is, and a constant threat one way or the other, and they're also very, very close to Sweden. Not as close as you are with Russia, but it's only the Baltic Sea in between St. Petersburg, Kaliningrad, and Stockholm and Sweden. So it's a very, very close. And of course, one of our closest allies, our closest friends, Finland, has a 1,300-kilometer border with Russia. So this is close to our heart. This was just to close and say that we are very much in the same boat as you are in trying to be prepared, trying to handle the threat from Russia. And also, as you said, and I will just conclude in saying that the Central Bank of Sweden and Swedes, and I'm actually talking about Swedes in general, are extremely supportive in the politics that supports Ukraine. So I could say with some confidence that we will continue to do that as long as it's necessary. So I'll stop there.
Thank you for your closing remark and for the great overview of what you do and your vision of the current challenges. I think it's a good time to open questions. So we have students who will be helping with microphones. Just a quick remark that usually when we have a new question, we raise a hand, and you have a follow-up question, you can put a finger, and I will know that you want to keep going on the same topic. Okay, and introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, greetings. My name is Dima. I'm a student of the fourth year of Institute of International Relations. And I wanted to ask about CBDC currency. I didn't quite understand the idea of it. Is it like a new cash? Is it just e-money? Is it like cryptocurrency? Could you explain in detail?
Okay, it's not cryptocurrency. So, I don't like the word cryptocurrency because it's crypto, it's not a currency. But I will not explain why, but for sure crypto is a thing that central bankers have a lot of difficulties with. But CBDC, it's and it's a very good question, because I think this is something that we all struggling. What is it, you know? And that's why I talked about this narrative, this anchoring. It is let's say that you had a wallet with CBDC. That would be mirrored in the balance sheet of the central bank, exactly as if you would have a note, Ukrainian note or Swedish note or a dollar note. That would be mirrored in the balance sheet of the central bank. So the idea is that to have a direct link to the. If you have an account in a Ukrainian bank, that is not directly mirrored. You have a claim vis-a-vis the bank. So that's the anchoring argument, that if you have it in the bank and you feel that this is kind of shaky, you could argue that it's good for the anchoring to have that possibility. So that's one argument. The other argument that is used, and I will stop after this because I'm not an expert in CBDC, is that it might also be used as a vehicle to improve the payment system. So one example that is used heavily in Europe, in Euroland, is that even though they have the same currency, even if you can go with the same note from Spain to France to Germany and it's no problem, it's very, very hard for a Spanish person to send money to a German person, because the banking sector has a lot of inertia. And then there are ideas and discussion, also fairly technical, advanced discussion, to use the CBDC as a bridge to make that happen. So I think that's the kind of general argument. But it's a good question, because although I said I think it's like 93, whatever, many countries that are exploring this, only a few have launched it, mainly in Asia. And that's, I think, the reason being that it's kind of hard to exactly fit it into the payment system. The idea is that you should have this claim to the central bank, but the interaction to the vis-a-vis the retailers should be through the banking. Basically, the banks should hook up to the CBDC, but they should have the interaction. They should have the app, if you like, to the retailer.
Thank you.
We have one more question from the KC alumni, and thank you, Dmitro.
Hello, my name is Maria, and I actually work at the National Bank of Ukraine on CBDCs.
Okay, you know the answer then.
Yes, that's why I can tell Dima that there is actually a piece on the Swedish National Bank's website that is called "The Difference Between CBDCs and Crypto Assets." So I recommend you to read it. So that's why I will not ask a question about CBDCs. The question I was going to ask is about the conscious choice of Sweden not to join Eurozone. When I talk to my Swedish friends, I think most of them sort of have been for a long time in favor of such a decision and support such a decision of the government. And with regards to that, I wanted to ask you, what's your perception of sort of balance of vulnerabilities and opportunities that Eurozone gives, especially, with now a chance that Ukraine, once we join the European Union, will have also this choice of joining the Eurozone or not. So that was going to be my question. Thanks.
Thank you very much. An extremely good question. I will be a little bit cautious here because whether we should join the euro or not is not a question for the central bank. It's actually a question for the parliament, for government. But I will kind of give some general remarks. When Finland was discussing this, they decided to join the euro. When the Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania was discussing, they would join in the euro. I think there were two reasons. One reason was the traditional economic reason. If you join that, trade will be more smooth. You take away the exchange rate risk. So that's I think, a valid economic argument. I also think, not only think, actually that was discussed, was also a security policy argument. That if we are even more connected, intertwined with Europe, it will be even harder for any aggressor to do us any harm. So I think there's a security policy argument, well, I guess will be extremely valid in the Ukrainian case. In Sweden, we didn't have the security, again, we have been naive, okay. So we didn't have the security policy, and this was many, many years ago as well. So we didn't have the security policy arguments. It was purely an economic discussion. And so one argument was more efficient trade, you take away the exchange rate risk. The counter argument is, of course, that you also take away the freedom to counteract imbalances that may be more Swedish specific than, let's say, Euro specific. So this inflation upturn that we have seen is very much a global phenomenon. So then you could argue that, and that's a fact, we have been very, very close to ECB when it comes to the interest rate path. But other types of crises, it might be different. And then it might be good both to have the currency as a shock absorber, so basically it could weaken and strengthen exports, but also be able to lower rates, let's say, more than otherwise, as we have our own monetary policy. And a good example of this, I think, again, I'm not saying that the one is better than the other, but look at the inflation rates in the Euroland. On average, it's one number, but it's a lot of difference between Estonia and Spain, for take two examples. Then, of course, you could argue that maybe Estonia should have its own interest rate and Spain another interest rate. Of course, that will never happen because they're part of the Euroland. But that's, I guess, illustrates the argument that some flexibility within your country has some merits. In Sweden, the debate is very, muted. We don't have much of that. I guess your friends are fairly young, and they were not around when we had the referendum. There is a nationalistic, I think, point here as well. Some people don't want to give up more power to Europe. They want to keep the power within the nation. I'm not saying it's wrong or right, but I'm just concluding that that's also an argument. The sovereignty, if you like. So I think that also plays in for some of the parties. And then, political decision making is very much about taking decisions when it's really necessary. And I'll give you one example. Sweden has an application to join NATO. We're waiting for Turkey to say yes. And that change from so many years of neutrality came within 3-4 months. And the reason, of course, was the war in Ukraine. So that was a crisis for Ukraine, but also for our security situation. And that totally changed our security policy. So I don't know what crisis should change our exchange rate policy, but that just saying that I think we need some kind of external force until we have a really kind of political debate. Finally, if you compare Denmark, fixed exchange rate, Sweden, within the EU, Sweden, flexible exchange rate within the EU, Finland, within the Euroland, our economic development has been fairly similar, no big difference. So you could argue that maybe exchange rates policy and monetary policy and currency union and what have you are important, but maybe not that important. More important, I think, is productivity, education level, good to educate yourself, infrastructure, the overall kind of pieces that puts together a successful economy, legal system, democracy. All of them, I think, is more important than the exchange rate kind of structure. Thanks.
All right, I see two hands. Yes, please. And introduce yourself.
My name is Dima, and I do not actually go to Kyiv School of Economics. I go to a different university, a state university, but I wish to pursue my master's degree here. And, well, my question is rather interesting for a central banker. Of course, you must know that the newly elected president of Argentina, Javier Milei, has announced his plans to dollarize the economy, and he frequently used to explain in national television how he would do this, and as far as I understood, he has 2 points of his plan. So the first point is that he wants to swap some of the Argentinian government securities for a different type of securities in a different country. So he would simply dollarize those securities, as far as I understand. And secondly, he wants to rescue the cash in the country, the pesos, with the rest of the securities the government has by quoting them at some percentage, let's say 20%. He said that it's possible to quote them at that percentage and dollarize the country in that way. My question to you is, well, first of all, how much plausible do you find Javier's plan to dollarize Argentinian economy? Is it like even, is it feasible as much as it was feasible in Salvador or Ecuador, those countries who dollarized previously in our history? And secondly, do you believe that it is a wise option for any sovereign country to change its national currency into a currency that is not emitted by that country, so that the country loses a lot of its monetary tools that it can actually exercise? Yeah, thanks.
A really good question. I'm not an expert in Argentina, but I've read a little bit about what he's doing and not doing. And I think you should put this into context. This is a crisis economy that's partly dollarized already. I talked to some Argentinian people and say basically a lot of Argentinians have their savings in dollar. They do some transactions in pesos, but then as the inflation is, so high and it's constantly depreciating, you can't store value in pesos. So it's only for transactions and then you store value in dollars. So partly this has already happened, right? So the whole idea that we talked about here on the earlier question about having your own monetary policy, being able to pursue kind of economic policy, fiscal, that's kind of gone, I think, in a country like that. So it's partly already dollarized. What you're doing here is, as you say, you basically bring in another country's currency. So what is, if we were to become Euro member, you could argue that's a similar thing. But that's in a totally different structure and order. Of course, we will do that first being a fixed exchange rate within a band, then having negotiations, then have a conversion rate from the krona to the euro, if we would do this. This is a hypothetical example. And then, which is important, then we will be part of the structure that actually has an influence of that currency, because then, the Riksbank will be part of that decision making. So there are similarities, but a lot of differences as well. What Argentina is doing is they we dollarize, but then we don't have anything to do with the rates, with the decision making, because that's totally kind of delegated to Federal Reserve, right? So I would say it's more of an extreme measure that you do in countries with extreme economic problems. Something is happening, and sometimes it's happened partly, and you just kind of take another step. Whether it's good or not, I would not be the right person to answer, because I think you need to more or less be an expert in developed economies, crisis economies. But for sure, the peso had a lot of issues already to start with. So I guess, the option here, whether you could fix that or whether you should go for a dollarization. So maybe not a full question, full answer, but anyway.
Well, I do understand. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Extremely happy to see you in person in Kiev. Thank you for coming in these times. And the question is basically, I believe that Swedish National Bank was the first, or maybe one of the first national banks in the world that introduced like unconventional monetary policy and created like negative deposits interest rates. And what could you say about that, like the implications of this policy, maybe the outcomes, and how did the Swedish government, the Swedish National Bank come up with such a decision? Thanks.
So this was before I came into office, but I'm sure this is extremely topical in Sweden now, because we have the National Audit Bureau have just investigated our quantitative easing, basically buying mortgage bonds and government bonds through 2015 until 2021-22. So it's extremely topical. They, the National Audit Bureau, were extremely critical to parts of that, not all of it. I would say like this, I think the negative interest rates have been debated, but we never had negative deposit rates for savers. They did in Denmark, actually, but we didn't. So I think in that sense, negative interest rates have not been so debated, because we had only slightly negative, and it was only negative from the Riksbank to the commercial banks. But the banks didn't set a minus rate on deposits to the general public. So I think that's another issue, because then it becomes a lot of discussion, how could you, why do you need to pay money when you store money? It's kind of hard to intellectually understand, right? So that was on negative interest. On the quantitative easing, I think this is heavily debated, because we have now been public that we're losing a lot of money on the bonds that we bought. We bought them at 1%, maybe, something like that. And now rates went up to like 3, now they're down a little bit. So basically, if you mark to market our bond holdings, that created a loss. So we have said publicly that we probably need a capital injection from taxpayers of some 80 billion Swedish, 8 billion euros, a lot of money, 1.5% of GDP. We'll see exactly what number it's going to be. And that has, of course, created a lot of debate. Was it worthwhile? And I think the general discussion now is that it's for sure worthwhile to save financial stability. So we, for example, had extreme turbulence in the corporate bond market. In order to not having that collapsing, the central bank bought corporate bonds, and that basically calmed down the market, brought down risk premiums, and got that market, the lending market working, which is extremely important. So I think most people agree that that's probably a tool you should have, and you should be able to use it in extreme circumstances. And this happened when COVID broke up in 2020. The other part, which was basically inflation rate is really a little bit too low, so we need to do whatever it takes to bring up inflation to anchor our inflation target. That was the first part of our buying. That's much more discussed, criticized, and I have been on the wire saying that I think we should have the tool, but I would be reluctant to use it. But I'm not saying that I will never, favor using it, but will be reluctant. And I think there's basically two reasons. One is that the effect on inflation is probably fairly limited, and the other one is that when you enter in big losses, you affect the pricing of bonds. You end up in issues that are a little bit hard for a central bank to handle. But it's extremely topical, so you could probably read some translated versions of our statements in this on our webpage in the weeks and months to come.
Hello, my name is Yegor. Thank you for having us today. It's a great opportunity. I'm a freshman at Naukma, and I would like to ask a question regarding the future of Europe. Ukraine, Europe, and the world itself is going through hard times. The decades of peace are over, and we see the rise of terror nations like Russia. Don't you think that we as Europeans, should move to closer integration, to become, some people want to create an army, European army. Others want to completely unify the political spectrum of Europe into one entity. We see that, for example, Hungary can freeze a bill worth of $50 billion that are vital for Ukraine. Don't you think that it is important to create a more homogeneous and a more united European state to overcome such issues of one country having the veto option?
So when you posed me a question, I was thinking how to answer this. And one way to answer is that next time in Kiev, you and I go out for a beer, and I will say my private thinking about this, because this is very kind of tricky for a central bank governor to have public statements about. What I can say is that what you are, I guess, hoping for, to some extent, is happening, right? We have deepened the relation in Europe. We have deepened the let's say, policy and foreign policy because of the Ukraine war, or the unlawful invasion by Russia to Ukraine. So to some extent, the pressure from that situation have actually pushed it in that direction. But you also alluded to that maybe the system is not geared for handling that, given that you have this veto. And of course, there is an ongoing discussion whether you have 1-2 tier Europe, whether you should have a different voting system. And exactly how you landed it. Traditionally, and I'm not saying that this is my view, traditionally Sweden has been reluctant to go into more of integration. Integration sounds good, right? But to get into more central power. Because I think being a fairly small country, of course, go into more centralized decision making, basically, the risk, I think many Swedes think, is that that's putting more power to Germany, Italy, I almost said the UK, but that's no. But France and Germany and Italy, and the small states might lose out in that. And that's been the Swedish kind of, I think, been reluctant to go down that route. But I have sympathy with your argument, and for sure I think that this is also, there are some positive signs. Europe, I agree that some states have gone in the wrong direction, and that I can actually say, because I'm definitely backing the Swedish position here. But it's also been clear that Europe had been able to introduce sanctions, to introduce fiscal kind of support to Ukraine, sending weapons to Ukraine. All of this has been very, very hard to do before this. So this crisis actually pushed Europe in the direction that you would like to see. But I think what's problematic here also, again, from a Swedish point of view, but maybe more generally, is that this would, need two things. You need to have foreign policy jointly, and that is always a sensitive thing for all countries. And the other thing, you need to have a fiscal union. You need to have centralized taxation. And that, from a political point of view, the risk is that you have more of Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, more of populist politics, because people feel further away from the political decision making. They know they're local politicians, but they feel kind of too distant from the European political system. So this is a long answer to saying nothing. But I tried to give you the arguments back and forth, but I will not say exactly what I think, because that's not in my role.
And
thank you, message, and we'll meet for a beer on the 3rd 18th. Yeah, thank you.
Well, invite me to this beer as well. I see two more hands, one hand here and one here over there, and one over there. So I think it's, okay, let's have the three final questions, because the governor has some other plans tonight.
Beer.
So, beer, yes. So please, can you pass the microphone?
I'm Artem Andrushenko from the National Bank of Ukraine, Monetary Policy Department. I have a more practical question about the recent macroeconomic developments. So after I got an invitation, I have tried to understand what is going on with the policy of the Riksbank. I downloaded many inflation reports and look at the data, for example, at inflation and the policy rate, and I saw that usually we think that the policy of the central bank should be forward-looking, but it looks like your policy was a little bit backward-looking. If it just trying to look at the annual inflation, but then I thought that annual inflation is quite smooth. So let's look into the more high-frequency data. I downloaded the monthly data, season adjusted it, and I saw that the first signs of much higher inflation was already seen in the first half of 2022. It looks for me that it was like twice higher than it was in 2021. And then I saw that you have started to raise interest rates. Before you had like 0, and then you have started just in the middle of the year, I think. And it was a big surprise for me that you have risen the rate only above the 1% when the inflation was already 10, more than 10. It was like a big shock for me. Of course, for Ukraine, 10% it's like normal inflation, but for the Sweden, I think it's enormous inflation. And the first part of the question, do you think that maybe your reaction was quite a bit slow? And then I have tried to understand what is your forecast of the policy rate. And I saw from February, by the way, you have 5 publications at the year, just for everybody to know this, not 4 like regular maybe.
We will actually have 4 next year. So.
Yeah. Okay. And I saw that the pattern of the revision for the policy rate was for many, many times from the almost beginning of 2022 and through the 22 and 23, you always have a revision upwards for the interest rate. So if you saw such behavior and you maybe, have you understood that your behavior was a shift? Have some shift, maybe you have thoughts about moving in this direction of tightening more quickly, but maybe something was, do you have some other obstacles? Maybe you told already about this mortgages that is linked to the policy rate. This is one part of the answer maybe. And the third part of the question about the overall mood of the society in the Sweden, does it blames you that you've done your work bad because inflation was very high, or your society is such mature that it understands that it's hard work and predicting the future is quite a bit a difficult task?
We're not that mature, I can assure you.
Yeah, thank you.
No, I'll try to ask. I did a really good question. I think in retrospect, we were too late to hike. There was a kind of a review on our monetary policy 2022 done by 3 academics, and they basically gave us fairly good kind of grades, say that in general it was kind of okay policies pursued in 22, but it said that if anything, you should have hiked more and earlier. I think I was not there yet, so at the center I started now in 2023. But I think what you could say is that the initial reaction or non-reaction from the central bank was based on the notion that this is a supply shock, that, you know, energy prices up, energy prices down, nothing else will happen, and look through it. So that was the kind of the first idea when we hiked in April the first time. We didn't do so in February. So February was this look through. It's probably only a supply shock. April, so inflation was actually more broad-based, so we hiked more. But I think also there is another part of this, and this is to some extent guessing, but I think for sure if I try to understand the mood in the society, we had many, many years with ultra-low rates, ultra-low inflation. So the perception was that inflation is low and will not go up. And we were not alone in this perception. This was a perception globally, I would argue. So I think when we saw inflation coming up, we saw it was more like temporary because that was usually the way it had been for many, many, many years. It turned out to be wrong. And actually we hiked by 1 percentage point, I think, early autumn 2022. So that's fairly significant. But we were behind the curve, and since, let's say, a half year back in time, I would say that our forecasts have been more in line with the outcome. We don't get that much blame. Well, we get some blame. We get blamed for a lot of things, but we get blamed for inflation being too high because that's our target. But of course, a lot of people are also angry that we are hiking rates and saying, why do you hike rates? Because this is supply driven, so you shouldn't hike rates. And we try to argue, yes, it started with a supply shock, but it also was a demand effect post-COVID, and it broadened the inflation to other parts of the economy. So I think that there's a lot of criticism going on, of course, against all central banks, but mainly because that the interest rate hike has been too aggressive rather than the other way around. Did I miss anything? I think basically.
Yeah, very good, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, so we still have 2 people, and let's have 1 question per person. So I think the gentleman in the back.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Thedéen, for your time. And I'm Alex. I'm studying international economics in Kyiv National University. And going back to those 4 features of central bank that should have to, I believe, to ensure like the most efficient way of their work, there are also transparency and accountability. So I'm just like trying to apply this to our Ukrainian context. And therefore, I would like you to answer, like to have like several ideas of what was the Swedish way of ensuring transparency and accountability of central bank, so that no one can, say, go beyond their power, and if they do, well, they will, let's say, face legal consequences. So yeah, thank you.
But I think one way of doing that is that the target is very well specified in the law, and it's even more specified in the new Central Bank Act. So it says inflation, low and stable prices is priority 1. If that's fulfilled, you could also think about the overall economic activity, employment, growth and such. We also have a second, and that's financial stability, but the overriding goal is always inflation. So, and this is an ongoing discussion among central bankers, but sometimes people want central banks to do a lot of other things. Could be the climate, could be security policy issues, could be general kind of economic growth issues. And the risk of that is that if you have this, as central bank call it, mandate creep, that you go beyond what you're actually asked to do, then the risk is exactly you say that, okay, they are doing that now, but nobody asked them. And now they're doing that, but they're actually failing on their main target. And then you have the risk of credibility going out, and then coming back to my discussion around constitutional independence and practical independence, or de facto independence. The de facto independence, there you need to be very, very strict that you're actually doing what the law is saying and nothing else. Otherwise, you end up in this discussion. I think to some extent the discussion we have had on quantitative easing, the buying of bonds, we think that this is within the mandate, but as some of the critics, I think that we, became a little bit more broad in our evaluation of what we actually should do. So I think that I guess is the answer. And then, this is not built, overnight. It's an ongoing battle to create credibility, to act transparently, to have a constitution, as I said. I was in a radio interview a couple of weeks ago, and the reporter asked me, aren't you undemocratic? You're 5 people deciding the interest rate, and there's no politicians there. And I said, well, you could argue that, but it's actually an act, a central bank law that was voted, where every party supported it in the parliament, saying that there should be 5 people deciding this. So I think that's democratic, right? But then it's, of course, extremely important that we keep into the mandate that the politicians, the elected politicians, said that we should do. So maybe that's an answer to your question. I think we need to be kind of proper here on what you're doing, what's said in the law.
Right, and there was a gentleman in the very back. You can step forward so we can see you. And it will be the final question. And after the final question, we will also have a photo, all of us.
All of us?
All of us,
fantastic.
Of course.
Good evening. Thank you very much. My name is Serhiy Shevchuk. I represent Forbes Ukraine Media. And I don't know how about everyone who's sitting here now, but I was surprised when I saw Mr. Jerome Powell among the candidates for Times Person of the Year. And I I'm watching and writing about central banks since we started this reform in Ukraine and started to reform in NBU. And on my point of view, the main issue of the reform is that you should, first of all, build an institution, and then you don't need to hire very good and powerful governor. At the same time, we see lots of examples when this position could become a sort of political. We could see a number of examples, I don't know, Lagarde, Bernanke, Yellen, and Jerome Powell, of course. And my question is, do you think this is good that we are discussing Jerome Powell as a candidate for a Person of the Year instead of as a candidate for a Nobel Prize in economics? Thank you.
Wow, what a question. I meet Jeremy Powell occasionally in Basel and so on, so I know him a little bit. I don't have a strong view who should be the man of the year, whatever you're referring to. So it's very hard but what was said in Stockholm when we had the Nobel Prize Awards, which I think was telling by several people, that this is one of the few occasions that we celebrate science and knowledge and facts. And that's the really fine thing, I think, with the Nobel Prize. There's a lot of media attention around a lot of other things, including media attention vis-a-vis the Riksbank. And I agree in that sense that we should pay more attention to, I guess, what this school stands for, science and facts and knowledge. I think is extremely important. But whether that will be for or against Jeremy Powell as Man of the Year, I will leave to others to judge.
All right, thank you very much for your lecture, for your answers, but also I want to extend my gratitude to students from other universities, because we have students from Kyiv National University, Mohila, CNEU. Thank you all for coming and joining our club of friends, people who are interested in research and science. And let's celebrate this with a final photo, okay? Okay, good. Thank you.
Oh, just. We'll give you this as a gift as well. Yes, a small gift from the Central Bank.